I met Lance on a Sunday evening at Cornerstone Baptist Church when I was 25 and finally ready to get serious about my future. I'd been attending for about 3 months, long enough to establish myself as a regular, but not so long that anyone would question my sudden appearance in their little community. Lance caught my attention immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was cute enough in that clean-cut, reliable way that screams financial stability, but because of the way other people talked about him. Lance started his own business when he was just 17, one of the church ladies whispered to me after service. Bought that beautiful house on Maple Street last year, all by himself. Such a good Christian man. Perfect. I made sure to sit 2 rows behind him the following Sunday. Close enough that he'd notice me during the meet and greet, but not so close that I'd seem desperate. When he turned around to shake hands, I gave him my most genuine smile and introduced myself as Michelle. "I'm still pretty new here," I said, letting a hint of vulnerability creep into my voice. "Everyone's been so welcoming, but it's still a little overwhelming. You know." He ate it up completely, those warm brown eyes lighting up with that protective instinct I'd learned to recognize in men like him. Men who'd been raised to take care of people, to fix problems, to be the hero in every story. "Would you like to grab dinner sometime this week?" he asked after we chatted for exactly 7 minutes about the sermon and my recent move to town. "I know this great little Italian place downtown. Nothing fancy, just good food and good company." I let myself look surprised and pleased, like the idea hadn't occurred to me. "I'd really like that," I said, and I meant it. Not because I was particularly interested in Lance as a person, I barely knew him, but because everything about him screamed security, stability, and most importantly, generosity. Our first dinner confirmed everything I'd hoped. Lance was exactly the kind of man who would insist on paying, who would ask thoughtful questions about my life, who would listen with genuine interest when I told him about my biology degree and my dreams of maybe going back to school someday. He was successful but not arrogant about it, confident but not cocky, and best of all, he was clearly smitten with me. I could see it in the way he leaned forward when I talked, the way he laughed a little too hard at my mediocre jokes, the way he walked me to my car and waited until I was safely inside before heading to his own vehicle. The key to a good strategy is patience, and I had plenty of that. For our entire first year together, I never asked Lance for anything. Not dinner, not drinks, not even gas money when we drove to visit his mother an hour away. I had my own job at a medical office, my own little apartment, my own life that I was perfectly capable of managing. I was the ideal girlfriend, supportive but independent, affectionate but not clingy, interested in his business, but not demanding of his time. I attended church with him every Sunday, smiled and chatted with the congregation, and slowly became part of the fabric of his world. Lance was a creature of habit in the most predictable ways. Every Tuesday, he'd bring me flowers from the grocery store, nothing expensive, just a small bouquet of whatever was on sale. But the gesture was consistent. Every Friday, we'd have dinner at his house, and I'd cook something simple while he told me about his week. Every Sunday after church, we'd go to lunch with whatever group had formed that day, and I'd sit quietly while the older women told stories about their grandchildren and the men discussed business or sports. It was during one of those Sunday lunches that I realized how perfectly I'd positioned myself. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been married for 47 years, leaned over and whispered, "That young man is absolutely devoted to you." "Dear, I haven't seen Lance this happy since, well, ever." She patted my hand with her wrinkled fingers. "You're good for him. He needs someone like you, someone steady and kind. Steady and kind." If she only knew, by our 18-month mark, I could predict Lance's moves like I was reading from a script. He'd been dropping hints about the future for weeks, casual mentions of when we're married and our kids someday, that made my stomach flutter with anticipation. Not because I was particularly excited about marrying Lance, but because marriage meant security, legal protection, and access to everything he'd built. When he suggested we attend the Sunday evening service at church instead of our usual morning routine, I knew exactly what was coming. He proposed right there in the sanctuary, in front of the entire congregation, during the testimony portion of the service. "I'd like to share something with everyone tonight," he said, standing up from our usual pew and taking my hand. "Michelle, you've brought so much joy and peace into my life. You've made me a better man, a better Christian, and I can't imagine spending another day without you." Then he dropped to one knee right there in the aisle, pulling out a ring that was exactly the size and style I would have chosen. Classic, elegant, expensive enough to impress, but not so flashy that it would seem inappropriate for a church setting. The congregation erupted in applause and happy tears, and I played my part perfectly. Surprised joy, emotional overwhelm, a breathless yes that carried to the back of the sanctuary. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly, and even some of the men looked misty-eyed. Lance slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that were actually shaking, and when he kissed me, I felt the satisfaction of a job well done. Phase 1. Complete. We were married 8 months later in a ceremony that Lance paid for entirely, despite my half-hearted offers to contribute. "I want to give you the wedding you deserve," he said when I mentioned splitting the costs. "Let me take care of everything." So I did. I let him handle the venue, the flowers, the photographer, the reception, all of it. I focused on playing the radiant bride, accepting congratulations from people who kept telling me how lucky I was to find such a good man. Moving into Lance's house felt like the natural conclusion to a successful campaign. He'd bought the place specifically with a future family in mind. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a big backyard, and a kitchen that was clearly designed for someone who actually knew how to cook. "Make yourself at home," he said on our first morning as a married couple, gesturing around the space like he was presenting me with a gift. "Change anything you want. This is your house now, too." But it wasn't really my house. Was it? It was Lance's house that he was graciously allowing me to live in. Lance's mortgage? Lance's insurance. Lance's name on the deed. I was just the pretty accessory he'd added to complete the picture of his perfect suburban life. The thought didn't bother me as much as it probably should have. We settled into married life with the same predictable routine that had characterized our dating relationship. Lance left for work at 6:30 every morning, came home at 5:15 every evening, and spent his weekends doing yard work or tinkering with projects around the house. I continued working at the medical office, contributing my modest salary to groceries and household expenses, while Lance handled the mortgage, utilities, and everything else that actually mattered. It was during one of those quiet evening routines, lying in bed after Lance had fallen asleep, with his arm draped over my waist, that I decided it was time for phase 2. "I've been thinking about something," I said the next night, waiting until we were in the same position, relaxed, intimate, guards down. "You know how I've always talked about maybe going back to school someday?" Lance shifted beside me, instantly alert. "Of course, you mentioned wanting to do something in public health." "Right. There's a master's program at the university," I said, letting excitement creep into my voice. "Public health administration? It's exactly what I've been dreaming about." "But," I trailed off, letting the silence hang between us. "But what?" "It's expensive, really expensive. And I'd have to cut back my hours at work to manage the coursework load, which means less income, right, when we'd need more money." I turned to face him in the darkness. "I know this is a big ask, but I'd love your help with tuition. I'll work as much as I can on the side, but this degree could change everything for us. I could get a job at a nonprofit, maybe even start my own organization someday. We could really make a difference in people's lives." The silence stretched for maybe 10 seconds before Lance spoke. "Of course," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Of course I'll help. We're a team. Michelle, your dreams are my dreams." Just like that. No questions about cost. No discussion of budgets or timelines. No request for me to research cheaper alternatives. Just immediate, complete support for whatever I wanted to do. It was almost too easy. "Are you sure?" I asked, because some small part of me felt like I should at least pretend to be concerned about the financial burden. "It's not just tuition. There are fees and books. And I probably need to get a small apartment near campus for the days when I have late classes or study groups. Whatever you need," Lance said, pulling me closer. "I'm so proud of you for wanting to do this. You're going to be amazing." And that was it. Decision made. Future secured. Lance's bank account officially at my disposal for the next 2 years. The graduate program was exactly what I'd expected. Challenging enough to be legitimate, but not so difficult that I couldn't maintain my image as the dedicated student while enjoying the benefits of Lance's financial support. He paid my tuition in full at the beginning of each semester, never questioning the amount or asking to see receipts. He covered my books, my fees, my parking passes, even the professional wardrobe I claimed I needed for internships and presentations. The studio apartment near campus was my favorite addition to the arrangement. It just makes sense. I explained to Lance when I brought up the idea 6 months into the program. Some of my study groups go really late, and I hate the idea of driving home alone at 10 or 11 at night. Plus, I could use it for research and writing when I need absolute quiet. Lance agreed immediately, of course, and even helped me pick out furniture for the space. What I didn't tell him was how much I enjoyed having somewhere that was entirely mine, somewhere he couldn't just show up unexpected with flowers or suggestions for dinner. The apartment became my refuge from the suffocating predictability of our marriage, a place where I could think and breathe and remember who I was before I became Lance's wife. It was in that apartment, during my second year of the program, that I started to realize how much I'd changed, or maybe how much I'd always been this person, but marriage to Lance had forced me to hide it. I was smarter than I'd given myself credit for, more ambitious, more interesting. My professors respected my ideas. My classmates sought out my opinions. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was being seen for who I actually was instead of who someone else needed me to be. The contrast with my home life became more obvious every day. Lance would pick me up from campus sometimes, appearing in the parking lot in his sensible sedan like some kind of suburban chauffeur, and I'd feel embarrassed by his eager smile and his questions about my day. "How was class?" "Beautiful. Learn anything interesting?" he'd ask, and I'd give him some sanitized version of whatever we'd discussed, leaving out the parts that I knew would go over his head or make him uncomfortable. My classmates started to notice the disconnect too. "Your husband seems nice," Sarah said one evening after Lance had dropped off dinner for our study group. Homemade sandwiches and cookies like we were children at a school picnic. "Very attentive?" The way she said it made it clear that attentive wasn't necessarily a compliment. "He takes care of me," I said, which was true, but somehow felt like an admission of weakness. "That's sweet," Sarah replied, but her tone suggested she found it anything but sweet. It must be nice not having to worry about money or logistics or any of that stuff the rest of us deal with. It was nice, but it was also starting to feel like a cage. Every time Lance paid for something, which was everything, I felt the invisible strings tightening around me. Every grateful smile I gave him, every kiss I offered in thanks, every time I played the role of the appreciative wife, I felt like I was disappearing a little more. By the time I started my second year, I'd stopped calling Lance during my breaks between classes. Our conversations had become predictable exchanges of information. His day. My day? What we needed from the grocery store. Whose turn it was to call his mother. I'd started staying on campus later, joining study groups that didn't really need me, accepting invitations to coffee or drinks with classmates who were becoming more interesting to me than my own husband. Lance noticed. "Of course. You seem tired lately?" he said one evening when I came home from a particularly late study session at Marcus's apartment. Marcus was in my policy analysis class, and we'd been working on a group project that somehow always seemed to require meetings that stretched past midnight. "Are you taking on too much? Maybe you should drop one of your electives." "I'm fine," I said, not bothering to hide my irritation. "This is what graduate school looks like. Lance, it's demanding. It's supposed to be demanding." "I know. I just worry about you. You're pushing yourself so hard. Someone has to," I said, and immediately regretted it. Not because it was mean, though it was, but because it revealed more than I'd intended. Lance looked hurt, which made me feel guilty, which made me angrier. "I'm going to bed," I announced, leaving him standing in the kitchen with that confused, wounded expression I was seeing more and more often. The truth was, I was starting to resent Lance for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate. He was doing everything right, supporting my education, giving me space to grow, never complaining about the time or money he was investing in my future. But somehow, his very goodness felt oppressive. His unwavering support felt like pressure to be grateful, to be the wife he deserved, to live up to the investment he was making in me. I started spending more time at the apartment, sometimes staying there overnight when I had early classes or late study sessions. Lance never questioned it, never demanded explanations or expressed jealousy. He just accepted my increasingly frequent absences with the same patient understanding he brought to everything else in our relationship. "You're so lucky," my classmate Jennifer said one afternoon, when I mentioned Lance's complete lack of possessiveness. "My boyfriend freaks out if I don't text him back within an hour. Your husband actually trusts you." But his trust felt less like respect and more like indifference. Would it kill him to ask a few more questions? To show some curiosity about who I was spending time with or what I was really doing during all those late nights away from home? His complete confidence in my faithfulness was starting to feel less like love and more like a lack of imagination. Everything changed when I graduated and started working at the Riverside Health Initiative, a nonprofit focused on community wellness programs. Suddenly, I was surrounded by people who understood ambition, who valued intelligence and innovation, who saw potential in me that went far beyond being someone's wife. My coworkers were passionate about their work, engaged with the world in ways that made Lance's small business concerns seem trivial by comparison. "You should come to happy hour with us Friday," my supervisor Karen suggested during my second week. "We usually hit that little wine bar on 5th Street. Nothing too crazy. Just a chance to decompress and get to know each other better." I've been planning to go home to Lance, to hear about his day and pretend interest in whatever client drama he was dealing with. But the alternative suddenly seemed much more appealing. "That sounds great," I said. "I'd love to join you." Happy hour turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a long conversation about healthcare policy and social justice. And by the time I got home at nearly 11 o'clock, I felt more energized than I had in months. Lance was waiting up for me, reading in bed with a bedside lamp, casting a warm circle of light around him. "How was your first week?" he asked, setting down his book and giving me that familiar smile that used to make me feel cherished and now just made me feel tired. "Good," I said, not bothering to elaborate. "Really good. I think I'm going to like it there. I'm so proud of you," Lance said, reaching for my hand as I sat on the edge of the bed. "All that hard work is finally paying off. All that hard work." As if my education had been some kind of hobby project instead of a serious academic achievement. As if the degree I'd earned, the knowledge I'd gained, the person I'd become was just a nice bonus to our suburban life instead of a fundamental transformation. I pulled my hand away and went to brush my teeth, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and wondering when I'd started to feel like a stranger in my own life. The happy hours became a regular thing. And then weekend events? And then occasional dinners at coworkers' apartments where we'd discuss policy papers and share stories about our careers and debate ideas that Lance wouldn't even understand, let alone find interesting. I stopped mentioning these gatherings to him, partly because I didn't want to deal with his questions, but mostly because they felt like something that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, I had friends who knew me as Michelle the public health professional, not Michelle the wife. People who valued my opinions, who sought my advice, who saw me as an individual with something important to contribute to the world. The contrast with my home life became more stark every day. Lance's world felt smaller and smaller by comparison. His concerns about client relationships and business expenses, his weekend projects around the house, his Sunday morning routine of church and lunch and afternoon naps, all of it started to feel suffocating. I'd outgrown our life together, but he seemed perfectly content to stay exactly where we'd always been. It was during one of those late-night conversations at Marcus's apartment. He'd graduated the year before me and was now working at a policy think tank, that someone mentioned an article they'd read about alternative relationship structures. "The whole concept of monogamy is really just a social construct," Sarah said, refilling her wine glass from the bottle we'd been sharing. "There's no biological imperative for it. No real reason why love has to be limited to one person forever." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "People change. They grow. They evolve. The idea that you're supposed to be the same person you were at 25 when you're 35 is ridiculous. Why should relationships be any different?" I found myself nodding along, feeling something click into place in my mind. It's like we're all just accepting these arbitrary rules because that's what we were taught. I said, "But what if there's a better way? What if we could be more honest about what we actually need instead of pretending that one person can meet every need forever?" The conversation continued for hours, touching on everything from evolutionary psychology to feminist theory to the practical logistics of open relationships. By the time I drove home at 2 a.m, my mind was spinning with possibilities I'd never seriously considered before. I started reading about it, academic papers, books, blogs written by people who'd successfully navigated non-monogamous relationships. The more I learned, the more sense it made. Why should I limit myself to Lance's narrow view of love and partnership when there was a whole world of connection and experience available? Why should I pretend to be satisfied with our predictable routine when I was clearly capable of so much more? The research phase lasted for weeks. I wanted to be thorough, to understand all the angles before I brought the topic up with Lance. This wasn't some impulsive decision or midlife crisis. It was a carefully considered evolution, based on genuine intellectual growth and self-awareness. I chose a Saturday morning to bring it up, timing the conversation for when Lance would be relaxed and open to new ideas. He was making omelets in the kitchen, humming some song I didn't recognize, looking perfectly content with our simple domestic routine. The sight of him there, so oblivious to how much I'd changed, how much I'd grown beyond the life we'd built together, filled me with a mixture of affection and impatience. "I've been doing some thinking," I said, settling onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. "About us, about our relationship, about what we want for the future." Lance looked up from the stove, spatula in hand, eyebrows raised with interest. "Oh, good thoughts. I hope." "I've been reading about open relationships," I said, deciding to dive straight in rather than dancing around the topic, about how people are finding ways to honor their growth and evolution without having to choose between personal development and partnership. The spatula stopped moving. Lance's expression shifted from interest to confusion, to something that might have been alarm. "Open relationships. I know it sounds radical at first," I continued, warming to my subject, "but when you really think about it, the idea that one person should meet every single need for another person forever is kind of unrealistic. Don't you think? I mean, we're not the same people we were when we got married." "I'm certainly not." "And that's a good thing. That's growth. That's evolution." Lance set down the spatula and turned to face me fully. Michelle, what are you saying exactly? I'm saying that maybe love doesn't have to look the way we were raised to believe it does. Maybe we could be more intentional about designing a relationship that actually serves who we're becoming instead of who we used to be. I could hear the excitement in my own voice, the conviction that came from weeks of research and consideration. I'm not saying I want a divorce. I'm saying we should evolve. The silence stretched between us for what felt like forever. Lance's face went through several expressions: confusion, hurt, disbelief, and finally something harder that I'd never seen before. Are you seeing someone? He asked quietly. The question caught me off guard, partly because it was more direct than I'd expected from Lance, and partly because it revealed how completely he'd missed the point. No, I said automatically, then realized that wasn't entirely honest. Not yet. But that's not what this is about, Lance. This is about us having the courage to be authentic about what we need instead of just accepting these arbitrary limitations. Arbitrary limitations. He repeated the phrase like he was testing how it tasted. You mean like marriage vows? Like commitment? Like the promises we made to each other in front of everyone we care about. Now he was being deliberately obtuse, reducing a complex philosophical discussion to simplistic moralizing. You're not listening to what I'm actually saying? I said, feeling my patience starting to fray. I'm trying to save our relationship by being honest about how I've grown, how we've both grown, instead of just pretending everything is fine when it's not. So everything is not fine. It wasn't a question. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that Lance wasn't stupid, just limited by his conventional upbringing and narrow worldview. Everything could be better, I said carefully. We could be more authentic, more intentional about meeting each other's actual needs instead of just going through the motions of what we think marriage is supposed to look like. Lance was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language, which I suppose I was, the language of growth, of evolution, of intellectual and emotional sophistication that went beyond his simple view of relationships. Let me make sure I understand, he said slowly. You want permission to sleep with other people? I want us to explore what it might look like to love each other enough to want the other person to experience everything life has to offer. I corrected. I want us to be brave enough to design our own relationship instead of just accepting what other people told us it should be. And you've already got someone in mind. There was something in his tone that made me defensive. This isn't about any specific person. Lance, this is about principles, about growth, about having the courage to be honest about what we need. But you do? Still not a question. I could feel the conversation slipping away from me, turning into something ugly and accusatory instead of the mature discussion I'd planned. There are people in my life who understand me in ways that I stopped, realizing how that would sound, in ways that I don't, in ways that complement what we have, I said quickly. That's the whole point of this, Lance. Different people can meet different needs. You don't have to be everything to me, and I don't have to be everything to you. Doesn't that sound freeing? Lance turned back to the stove and flipped off the burner. The omelets were probably ruined, but he didn't seem to care. When he turned back to me, his face was completely calm, which somehow felt more ominous than if he'd been yelling. You got your degree? He said quietly. Your job? Your new circle of friends. Your whole new identity. And now you're done with me? Just admit it. That's not... I started, but he held up a hand. You asked me to help you build your future. And I did. I paid for everything. Supported everything. Never questioned anything you said you needed. But now that you're standing on your own 2 feet, you want to run into someone else's arms. That's not freedom. Michelle, that's betrayal. The word hit me like a slap. Betrayal. I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm trying to include you in my growth instead of just leaving, which is what most people would do. I'm offering you the chance to evolve with me by sharing you with other men, by acknowledging that love is bigger than possession. I shot back. By admitting that maybe the way we were taught to do relationships isn't the only way, or even the best way. Lance was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to memorize it. How long have you been planning this? I haven't been planning anything. I've been growing. Lance. I've been learning and thinking and becoming more than I was when we got married. I thought you'd be proud of that. And there's someone you want to explore this with? I felt my cheeks flush. There might be someone who understands what I'm talking about. Yes. Someone who's also interested in designing relationships that serve growth instead of limiting it. Someone from work. It wasn't a question. And I didn't answer it. What's his name? Lance. You're missing the entire point. What's his name? Michelle. The way he said my name made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't going at all the way I'd imagined. I'd expected resistance, maybe some hurt feelings. But ultimately, I'd thought Lance would recognize the wisdom in what I was proposing. I'd thought his love for me would make him want to support my continued growth. just like he'd supported my education. Marcus, I said quietly. But it's not about him specifically. It's about the principal. Lance nodded slowly, like something had finally clicked into place. Marcus from your graduate program. The one whose apartment you've been spending so much time at? We've been working together, yes, and talking, and he's helped me understand some things about myself that I didn't realize before. I bet he has. The sarcasm in Lance's voice was unfamiliar and unpleasant. This wasn't the patient, understanding man I'd married. This was someone harder. Someone who was making me feel like the villain instead of recognizing that I was trying to do the right thing by being honest. You're being deliberately cruel, I said, feeling tears start to prick at my eyes. I'm trying to share something important with you, something that could make us both happier, and you're acting like I'm some kind of monster. You want to cheat on me, and you want my permission to do it, Lance said flatly, and you want me to thank you for being honest about it. I want us to grow together instead of growing apart, I said, the tears coming harder now. I want us to be brave enough to love each other in a way that honors who we're becoming, not who we used to be. But if you can't even have a conversation about it without being cruel and closed-minded, then maybe that tells me everything I need to know about how much you actually care about my happiness. Lance stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something changing in his expression. The hurt was still there, but it was hardening into something else. Something final. Get out, he said quietly. What? Get out? Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Lance, you're being extreme. Can't we just... There's nothing extreme about having boundaries. Michelle, there's nothing extreme about refusing to share my wife with another man. There's nothing extreme about ending a marriage when one person decides the vows don't matter anymore. The vows were about loving each other, I said desperately. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to love you enough to be honest, instead of just sneaking around behind your back, like most people would do. How generous of you. The coldness in his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard from him before. This wasn't my patient. Understanding husband? This was a stranger, someone who was making me feel small and selfish and wrong when I was trying to do the right thing. Fine, I said, standing up from the bar stool with as much dignity as I could manage. If you want to throw away everything we built together just because I dared to suggest we could be more evolved than your parents, that's your choice. My choice, Lance repeated. Right. I went upstairs and started packing, throwing clothes and toiletries into suitcases while tears streamed down my face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Lance was supposed to love me enough to at least consider what I was proposing. He was supposed to want me to be happy, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. Instead, he was acting like some kind of possessive caveman, like I was his property instead of his partner. When I came back downstairs with my bags, Lance was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd reconsidered. Maybe he was ready to have a real conversation about what I'd been trying to tell him. Lance, I said softly. He looked up, and his eyes were red, but his expression was resolved. I'll have the rest of your things boxed up. You can arrange to pick them up when I'm not here. The finality in his voice made my chest tight. It doesn't have to be like this, I said. We could try counseling. It's already like this, he said. It's been like this for months, apparently. I was just too stupid to see it. I wanted to argue, to explain that he was wrong, that I'd been trying to include him in my growth instead of excluding him. But the look on his face told me there was no point. He'd made up his mind to be the victim in this story instead of recognizing that I was offering him a gift. The gift of honesty, of authenticity, of a relationship that could evolve with us instead of trapping us in roles we'd outgrown. I left the ring on the kitchen counter on my way out. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because it felt dishonest to keep wearing it when Lance had made it clear he didn't want the kind of marriage I was offering. The ring represented his vision of love. Possessive. Limiting. Conventional. I was ready for something bigger than that. Something that honored growth and possibility instead of just security and tradition. The sound of the door closing behind me felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I was scared, certainly, and hurt by Lance's refusal to even consider what I'd been trying to tell him. But I was also relieved. For the first time in years, I was free to be completely myself, to explore connections that fed my soul instead of just providing financial security. I drove to my apartment near campus, the one Lance had paid for, though I tried not to think about that, and sat in the parking lot for a long time, crying and shaking and trying to process what had just happened. I'd expected hurt feelings, maybe some initial resistance, but I'd never imagined Lance would be so completely unwilling to even discuss the possibility of growth and change. When I finally went inside and tried to call him, I discovered he'd already blocked my number. When I tried to reach out through social media, I found myself blocked there too. It was like he decided to erase me completely, to pretend our entire relationship had never happened rather than deal with the reality of who I'd become. The cruelty of it took my breath away, after everything we'd shared, after all the support and love and partnership. He was willing to throw it all away rather than have an honest conversation about what our relationship could become. He'd rather nurse his wounded pride than fight for what we'd built together. Over the following weeks, I kept expecting him to reach out, to apologize for his extreme reaction, to ask if we could try again with better communication and more openness to growth. But the silence stretched on, complete and devastating. When I drove by the house, our house, the place where I'd thought I was building a life, I saw that he'd changed the locks, replaced the garage door opener, even installed a security system. He was fortifying himself against me, like I was some kind of threat instead of the woman who'd loved him, who'd tried to love him enough to be honest about my needs. I threw myself into work, into my new friendships, into exploring the connections that Lance had been too narrow-minded to accept. Marcus and I started seeing each other officially, and the contrast with my marriage was striking. Here was someone who valued my mind, who was excited by my ambitions, who saw my growth as something to celebrate rather than something to contain. We could talk for hours about policy and philosophy and the future we wanted to build together. He understood that love could be expansive rather than limiting. That commitment could evolve rather than staying frozen in place. But even as I built this new life, part of me kept waiting for Lance to come to his senses. I imagined him realizing what he'd lost, recognizing that my honesty had been a gift rather than a betrayal. I pictured him calling to apologize, to ask if we could try again with better understanding of what I needed to be happy. The call never came. Months passed, then a year, then longer. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Lance's business was thriving, that he seemed to